Welcome back to part 2. So when I left off, I was telling you the story of this remarkable story about how similar these two Jims were who had been separated about 4 weeks after they were born. And it was incredible, down to the dog's name. It's just crazy. So picking up the story right there. 1 month later, the brothers became the very first twin pair tested by the University of Minnesota psychologist named Thomas Bouchard and his colleagues. This began a study of separated twins that actually extends to the present day. In fact, on the Google Classroom, I have a link to the University of Minnesota, which, by the way, is the Twin City. Minneapolis is the Twin City, which is where this university is, and the Minnesota Twins play there. Anyway, so there's an extended twin study that lasts to this day. And their voice intonations and inflections were so similar that when one of the twins heard playback of an earlier interview, Jim Springer, for example, guessed that it was himself and it was actually his brother. So given tests measuring their personality, intelligence, heart rate, and brain waves, the Jim twins, despite 38 years of separation, were virtually as alike as the same person tested twice. Both married women named Dorothy. But as Judith Rich Harris 2006 notes, it is hardly weirder than some of the other reported similarities. I'm going to get rid of their picture and talk to you about a couple of others. So these two twin friars, they're named Julian and Adrian, and they both died of heart failure at age 92 on the exact same day in 2011. Aided by publicity in magazines and newspaper stories, Bouchard, we're now back to the psychologist that's running the studies at University of Minnesota, and his colleagues located and studied 74 pairs of identical twins reared apart. They continued to find unbelievable similarities, not only of tastes and physical attributes, but also of personality. In Sweden, Nancy Peterson and her co-workers in 1988 identified 99 separated identical twin pairs and more than 200 separated fraternal twin pairs. Compared with equivalent samples of identical twins reared together, the separated identical twins had somewhat less identical personalities. Still, separated twins were more alike if genetically identical than if fraternal. And separation shortly after birth, rather than, say, at age 8 or so, did not amplify their personality differences. Stories of startling twin similarities don't really impress Bouchard's critics, who remind us that the plural of anecdote is not data. So anecdotal stories like the ones that I've told you aren't the same as longitudinal studies with lots of numbers, like we've talked about before, what makes a good experiment. Even the more impressive data from personality assessments are clouded by the reunion of many of the separated twins some years before they were tested. Moreover, identical twins share an appearance and the responses it evokes. Adoption agencies also tend to place separated twins in similar-like homes. Despite these criticisms of the kind of research study findings, the striking twin study results helped shift scientific thinking toward a greater appreciation for genetic influences. Biological versus adoptive relatives. For behavioral geneticists, nature's second real-life experiment, adoption, creates two groups: genetic relatives, which are biological parents and siblings, and environmental relatives, adoptive parents and siblings. For any given trait, we can therefore ask whether adopted children are more like their biological parents who contributed their genes or their adoptive parents who contributed the home environment. While sharing the home environment, do adopted siblings also come to share the same traits? The stunning finding from studies of hundreds of adoptive families is that people who grew up together, whether biologically related or not, do not much resemble one another in personality. In traits such as extroversion and agreeableness, adoptees are more similar to their biological parents than their caregiving adoptive parents. The finding is important enough to bear repeating. The environment shared by a family's children has virtually no discernible impact on their personalities. I'm sure some of you, I know Chris, for example, has talked about how different he is from his brother. And I am sure if you guys think about you and your siblings, maybe in your families too, you can identify some significant character trait differences despite growing up in the same environment. Two adopted children reared in the same home are no more likely to share personality traits with each other than the child down the block. Heredity shapes other primate personalities too. They did some tests on a type of monkey raised by foster mothers, and the monkeys raised by foster mothers exhibit social behaviors that resemble their biological rather than foster mothers. Add all this to the similarity of identical twins, whether they grow up together or apart, and the effect of a shared rearing environment seems shockingly modest, which means there's not much to it. What we have here is perhaps like really important, the most important puzzle in the history of psychology, perhaps, according to some. Why are children in the same family so different? Why does shared family environment have such little effect on children's personalities? Is it because each sibling experiences unique peer influences and life events? Maybe it's because sibling relationships like kind of ricochet off of each other, amplifying differences. Maybe because siblings share half their genes, have very different combinations of genes, and may evoke very different kinds of parenting. I don't know. Such questions fuel the curiosity of scientists. The new frontier, molecular genetics. So what is the promise of molecular genetics research? Behavioral geneticists have progressed by asking, do genes influence behavior? The new frontier of behavior genetics research draws on bottom-up molecular genetics as it seeks to identify specific genes that influence behavior. As a definition, if you want it, molecular genetics is the subfield of biology that studies the molecular structure and function of genes. As we've already seen, most human traits are influenced by a team of genes. For example, twins and adoption studies tell us that heredity influences body weight, but there is no single obesity gene. More likely, some genes influence how quickly the stomach tells the brain, I'm full. Others might indicate how much fuel the muscles need and how many calories are burned off by fidgeting, and how efficiently the body converts extra calories into fat. Given that genes typically are not solo players, the goal of molecular behavior genetics is to find some of the many genes that together orchestrate traits such as body weight, sexual orientation, extroversion, all sorts of things. Genetic tests can now reveal at-risk populations for many diseases. The research continues in labs worldwide where molecular geneticists are teaming with psychologists to pinpoint genes that put people at risk for things like learning disorders, depression, schizophrenia, alcohol use disorders. To tease out the implicated genes, molecular behavioral geneticists find families that have had the disorder across several generations, and they draw blood or take cheek swabs from both affected and unaffected family members, and then they examine DNA looking for differences. The most powerful potential for DNA, note Robert Plomin and John Crabb of 2000, is to predict risk so that steps can be taken to prevent problems before they happen. Aided by inexpensive DNA scanning techniques, medical personnel are becoming able to give would-be parents a readout of how their fetus genes differ from the normal pattern and what that might mean. With this benefit comes risks. This is the conversation I wanted to start off with in class, because this is where a lot of kind of the ethics of this genetical testing comes in, Might labeling a fetus at risk for a learning disorder lead to discrimination? Or does prenatal screening pose ethical dilemmas like, are people more likely to not carry a fetus to term if they find out that there's some sort of genetical malady? In China and India, where boys are highly valued, testing for an offspring's sex has enabled selective abortions, resulting in millions of missing women. Assuming it were possible, should prospective parents take their eggs and sperm to genetics labs for screening before combining them to produce an embryo? I mean, this leads to all sorts of questions. Heritability. What is heritability and how does it relate to individuals and groups? So using twin and adoption studies, behavioral geneticists can mathematically estimate the heritability of a trait. Heritability's definition is this: the proportion of variation among individuals that we can attribute to genes. The heritability of a trait may vary depending on the range of population and environments studied. So back to this: the extent to which the variation amongst individuals can be attributed to their differing genes. Just a minute. So while we can never say with certainty what percentage of an individual's personality or intelligence is inherited, heritability refers to this extent to which differences among people are attributable to genes. So while there's a relationship, it's impossible to give specific numbers on that. As environments become more similar, for example, like schools, for example, where everybody's going to a similar type of environment for at least part of the day, heredity as a source of differences necessarily becomes even more important. For example, if all schools were of uniform quality, all families equally loving, and all neighborhoods equally healthy, then heritability would increase because differences due to environment would decrease. At the other extreme, if all people had similar heredities, but were raised in drastically different environments, heritability would be much lower. Anyway, as with height and weight, so with personality and intelligence scores. Heritable individual differences need not imply heritable group differences. If some individuals are genetically disposed to be more aggressive than others, that needn't explain why some groups are more aggressive than others. In other words, we're not looking to reinforce stereotypes and things like that. 3 minutes to go. I've got one more topic to cover: gene-environment interaction. So how do heredity and the environment work together? Among our similarities, the most important, the behavioral hallmark of our species, is our enormous adaptive capacity. Some human traits, such as having 2 eyes, develop the same in virtually every environment, but other traits are expressed only in particular environments. So go barefoot for a summer and you'll develop toughened, calloused feet, a biological adaptation to friction. Meanwhile, your shod neighbor will remain a tenderfoot. The difference between the two of you is, of course, the effect of environment, but it's also the product of biological mechanism, which is adaptation. Our shared biology enables our developed diversity. To say that genes and experience are both important is very true. But more precisely, they interact. Imagine 2 babies, one genetically predisposed to be attractive, sociable, and easygoing, the other less so. Assume further that the first baby attracts more affectionate and stimulating care, and so develops into a warmer and more outgoing person. As the 2 children grow older, the more naturally outgoing child often seeks activities and friends that encourage further social confidence, while the other may not. What has caused the resulting personality differences? Neither heredity nor experience dances alone. Environments trigger gene activity, and our genetically influenced traits evoke significant responses in others. Thus, a child's impulsivity and aggression may evoke an angry response from a teacher who reacts warmly to a child who models appropriate behavior. Parents, too, may treat their own children differently. One child elicits punishment and the other does not. In such cases, the child's nature and the parent's nurture interact. Neither operates apart from one another. So gene and the scene dance together. So if you recall at the beginning, we talked about genes being either active, expressed, or reactive. A new field, epigenetics, meaning in addition to or above and beyond genetics, is studying the molecular mechanisms by which environments trigger genetic expression. Although genes have the potential to influence development, environmental triggers can switch them on or off, much as your computer software directs your printer. One such epigenetic mark is the organic methyl molecule attached to part of the DNA strand. It instructs the cell to ignore any gene present in that DNA segment, by preventing the DNA from producing the protein coded by that gene. Environmental factors such as diet, drugs, and stress can affect epigenetic molecules.